why are we talking about pattern languages and Christopher Alexander? Peter already mentioned the conference Purple Sock that will be next year, and the workshop in November. And we want to inspire people to participate and hopefully to contribute to these events. What is the situation? We think that a pattern research community is forming, and the Purple Sock team, the team around these events, wants to support this forming of a new scientific community. The second point is what could be interesting to scientists. What is this pattern concept about? There are new research targets. I'd call it very complex systems, living systems. And there are interesting changes in the paradigms that we are using. I will be talking about the scientific products that are on the table. This is about writing specific pattern language papers, or writing pattern language books, or create pattern repositories as a kind of knowledge format for exchange of experiential knowledge. And we can also create a new type of expertise on these application areas. And the last point is I want to give an overview over the work and ideas of Christopher Alexander. This is especially the concept of the pattern language that's in the title of the lecture, but it's also about the pattern concept itself that's below the pattern language, and the model for the creative process that builds upon the pattern language. And in the end, I will talk a bit about the ethics of design that can be derived from all this work of Christopher Alexander. So, who is this guy, Christopher Alexander? Architect, mathematician, design theorist, born 100 kilometers from here in Vienna in 1936. With his parents, he fled from the Nazis to England, studied at Cambridge, made his master in architecture and master in mathematics and bachelor in architecture, and wrote the first dissertation at the Harvard University. So he was the first architect who graduated at Harvard, and he won a great award from the American Association of Architects. So he was a star, very young, and he became a professor at the University of Berkeley, and he was a teacher there, a professor for 30 years, and he did a lot of building projects and wrote more than a dozen books and got many awards and is a member of academies, and now he lives as a professor emeritus in South England, and he's 78 and rather sick, not so, and he's withdrawn from public more or less. So I get into the story about in 2000 when I first came in contact with patterns, and after studying all this, I felt I could write a small book to introduce friends to the topic. It's called Mustertheorie Pattern Theory, Introduction and Perspectives on the Tracks of Christopher Alexander. So I put my knowledge of that time, of 2007, into this book. And the basic proposition of this book is Christopher Alexander's ideas and theories are highly relevant for us, far, far beyond architecture. Architecture is only a small part of it. So after 2007, I started to give talks and lectures and workshops, not many, but every now and then. And I tried to visualize what's in Christopher Alexander. and I created last year concept cards, a stack of concept cards that give the core ideas of Christoph Alexander in a handy form for teaching. And I will also use these cards to illustrate my lecture on some points, so I better show you how they're built. There is a format to these cards, and the title is clear, metaphorical image or diagram. In this case, we are talking about pattern language, and the image shows a toolbox from craftsmen. So the idea of a pattern language is to give people a toolbox in their hand for the design work. So this is the abstract idea. And after the image, there is an explaining text. We don't need to go into the detail. And then some questions that lead the reader into considering this concept. And on the bottom is a list of related concepts. So the concepts are all interlinked and interwoven, so they form a complete universe. So Christoph Alexander invented the concept of a pattern. So this means pattern is a technical term, not the everyday language word pattern. What he says is a pattern is a kind of problem-solution pattern. So he says each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment. And then it describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way, and he means an abstract way, that you can use the solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. So it's something about reusable concept, reusable mental concepts. He wrote that in 1977 in this book, A Pattern Language, which made him famous and which created the term pattern language. So a pattern is a kind of structured knowledge, and it has typical entries or typical aspects that are described, that are part of this description. We have a name, a problem, solution, inputs, outputs, connected patterns, alternative patterns. It's like a data structure. Of course, if pattern is a concept, it must be in the card stack. So you have this pattern card, and the metaphorical picture is the picture of a bridge. So bridge is the abstract concept, and Golden Gate Bridge is the implementation. And we have millions of bridges all over the world, and it's absolutely every day for us. We don't think about bridges, of course. It's just to make the idea clear. And what's interesting is that all these problem solutions have certain logics that can be attached to them. So if we have a problem solution, then we must assume that there are other solutions to the problems, that there are alternative patterns. And of course there are connected patterns. And of course, if we build this, then these are artifacts. So they could be in any other way designed or built. So to give another example, I use the concept of commons, of common goods, of common good projects as a generic pattern and describe it in this way. The problem is that in crisis many people cannot afford their livelihoods under the existing conditions, or they fear that future developments could bring them into poverty. So a solution could be that certain necessities of life are organized as common goods in a way that people can access them for free or very cheap and have fair access to these resources. So we can consider the forces, the related patterns. Commons have to be protected. People have to care for that. What are the results? Livelihoods become cheaper. Quality of life is improved. We can talk about a lot of aspects and describe that, how it's done. Examples, for example, a public library. You don't need to pay a lot to use it, or an urban gardening project, or there are even commons-based water supplies in Italy. Another example for such a commons pattern is the Wikipedia. You know, years ago, 20 years ago, an encyclopedia was very expensive. You had to pay $1,000 or $2,000 or euro to buy 20 or 30 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica or Brockhaus. And now, since 2003, we have the Wikipedia actually more or less for free. Another example, not from the internet, the Alpine Associations with more than 1 million members have built during 150 years about 100,000 kilometers of footpaths in the Alpine region, and more than 1,000 huts where you can sleep when you are mountaineering. So these are common goods that have been produced, and behind these common goods we can see the abstract pattern of the commons. And it's something that has been done 1,000 years ago and will be done in the future. So we think it's important to understand this cultural inheritage, and patterns are a good form for that. Christoph Alexander wrote a lot of books. 14 are here on this slide. And the most famous is a pattern language. It's this one. And this was his highly awarded thesis. And these 4 books, The Nature of Order, is his philosophical opus magnum he wrote about 10 years ago. I won't go into the details here. So this book, A Pattern Language, describes about 250 architectural patterns, from the large ones of regional planning down through city planning, buildings, interior planning, to the smallest things. And it's like a showcase of architectural patterns and a great introduction to architectural knowledge. And although in architecture this did not really take off, because the architects knew more than these 250 patterns, and to other people who were not architects, this was a great introduction to architecture. They got an overview of how an architectural world looks like, and they got inspired. And so you find a lot of books that use the same format, the same idea of the patterns. You have in software architecture the famous book Design Patterns. In software, patterns have become mainstream. There have been patterns collected. In 2000 there was this pattern almanac printed with more than 2,000 patterns in it. They're very short descriptions, more or less a directory of patterns. Very basic. It has come from software to organizational development and to social activism and to many other. I have an assortment of books here, up to Peter's book about patterns in e-learning, or patterns, or patterns in firefighting, or patterns in movie production. So this is a concept that was and is very successfully. Brings me to the question, how many pattern languages and patterns are there out there in the world? It's hard to say. But most that has to do with humans, with things that we call designing or creating, management, unfolding, developing, building, planning, healing, fighting, playing, can be put into a pattern form. Quite normal examples are patterns of commons projects, patterns of civil society, or patterns of storytelling, or patterns of dialogue and communication, patterns of village development, or patterns of learning and education. And there are extremely specific examples like patterns of jazz improvisation, or patterns of costume management in movie productions. There's a dissertation on this in Stuttgart at the university. And this, I already mentioned this dissertation about pattern language in firefighting. The idea is that one must understand these structures of firefighting to build computing devices that support this. So this is actually a work for ubiquitous computing. So a few years ago I did a quick estimate, and I estimated about 30,000 pattern languages out there and about 500,000 patterns that wait to be described. And 1 or 2% of them are described currently. So this is a vast scientific field. One has just to trip there and take something out, and it's totally fresh. Last weekend, I tried to add a bit more structure on this lecture, and I built this pyramid. On the base, on the level 0, there is this concept of the pattern. Typically, there's not much talked about this concept because it's simple. Problem-solution pattern in a structured form. But it has philosophical consequences that are non-trivial. We could go into that if we have a lot of time today. The first level, level 1, is that of pattern languages. That's the normal level, writing such books in certain application fields. The third level is about the use of these pattern languages actual in design. So there's a model about the creative process. I call it here the creative cycle. So Christoph Alexander pictured an ideal, typical model of design, in a way demystificating the design process, making it available to normal people like me, for example. And on the top of the pyramid, there are ethical considerations. So the idea is that the creative process only then works very good when there is a certain attitude behind the designer. So, but the main focus of this lecture is on level 1, on the pattern language issues. The other things I will just give an overview. So what does a pattern language concept provide? First of all, it's a toolbox for an analyst. He looks into an application area and finds these patterns, he describes them, and it becomes his toolbox. Second, it's for other people something like a form language or a design vocabulary. They can use it to build systems, and they can communicate in the community between experts and laypersons and the whole spectrum of people, politicians, whatever stakeholders are available. Then it's a knowledge format for a science community. You have it in the books, you have it in repositories, and the structure is known, it's adaptable, it's negotiable. The content is modular, you can add patterns of your own. It's not very much interlinked, it's not ideological. You can contribute to it very easily. And last but not least, as you can see, it created almost a kind of book genre for non-fictional books. So I'll talk about that too. Which means that non-experts will read the books that normally only experts read. An interesting thing. And I've added a quotation from Wittgenstein. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Famous quotation from Wittgenstein. So in doing pattern languages, we actually enhance our interaction with the world, what we can understand and what we can do. It's interesting that the structure of a typical pattern language book is very simple, because apart from introduction and context and certain stories, the main body of the book is a sequence of patterns that are described in a structural form. So it's rather easy to write a pattern language book. You exactly know where you find the things and where you have to write about, for example, the problem of pattern 17. It's not distributed over the whole book. It's in a certain place. So it's very simple. Of course, not everyone is up to writing books. One could write a pattern language paper. This is typically much smaller, perhaps 10 pages, and you cannot describe 100 patterns in such small space. So what do people do? They focus on the main patterns, the core patterns, for example, 5 or 10 patterns, and give only short descriptions, such as these here. Only this is a pattern, few lines of text. For all the others, less important patterns. So you get a pattern language, or good part of a pattern language, into a paper, into a scientific paper. There is a sister conference to the Purple Sock. It's called EuroPLOP, and it's every year in Germany, near Munich, at the monastery in Irsee. And the interesting thing of this conference is, Peter can tell you stories about it because he was there, I wasn't, is that there is a very elaborated workflow for wannabe pattern authors. So they can submit a raw pattern language paper, and they get assigned a shepherd, a kind of mentor, a helper, who gives feedback to the author, and then there are 2 or 3 or 4 feedback cycles. And when the pattern paper is refined, then it is comes to the conference. And at the conference, there's not a normal presentation. There is a workshop with other pattern authors, and they have read the paper before and thought about it, and they give positive feedback what they would improve with the paper. So there's a really constructive situation for the authors, and the paper is published after refining and after the conference and the proceedings. So if someone has the time, he could get into writing pattern languages by the means of the EuroPLOP conference. I think it's a nice thing to do. Christopher Alexander, said that when he started his research, he asked the question, how can we achieve optimal design? How can we make great buildings? And he says he has found two things that are of utmost importance. The first of it is that it's not beauty that a designer is after, but it's something that he called a quality without a name, originally. He had no name for it, for this quality. And later he called it the quality of living systems. We in German, we have a word for it. In English, actually, there's no very good word for this. And we can call it Lebendigkeit. Life is Leben in German. Living is lebendig in German. And the quality of living systems is Lebendigkeit. If you do it in English, you would have to say livingness. That word doesn't exist, or vividness, or vitality. But usually this has a biological meaning, so it doesn't fit the point. So the yellow things are what Alexander thinks we should be after. We should create living cities, or a living organization, or a living community, or a living self. And living not meant in the biological sense, but in the sense of being vital, of being interactive, of being happy, of being free. So he redefines the design goal. And his second discovery is that we have a feeling for this. We need no expert to access this. But every one of us has a feeling what is good for him, or what environment he likes and prefers. Probably every organism, every biological organism must have such a feeling, to move in places where he can live, even if he has no consciousness. So deep in us, there is a feeling about the living quality of systems, and Alexander tells us to find this within us and to develop this ability to judge the living quality. So what he actually did was to do comparison judgments. He used pictures of two systems and put them side by side, and said to his students, look at these pictures. Which system can you identify yourself better with? Or which system mirrors more yourself, what you are, or what you want to be? Or which system are you more in resonance with? And if people are inclined, if they are able to cope with this question, then there is a remarkable consensus among people, typically 90% and more, who then choose one or the other of this. And this is an indicator to Christoph Alexander that this feeling for the living quality of things has something objective. I won't go into the wars that broke out when he did this with students and the professors who favored the right side building style. More typical would be to have very similar systems to compare. Design variations. You look at this and say, which of these two chairs would you prefer to sit on the next 20 years, let's say? Which is feels better. And we can even simplify this more and give a simple structure of 3 dots and say, is it the left one or the right one that has more this quality of a living system? So, of course, there are cards related to the quality of living systems as a concept or topic, and about this kind of judgment, where we seek a resonance, like strings that are vibrating and resonate with each other. And I made this drawing of a mixture of strings that are resonating and of eyes that are looking, and call this the eyes of resonance diagram to somehow visualize what it's all about. And if we look at such systems, then and think about when do we feel that these are living systems, then there are other concepts that are important. One of these concepts is the concept of the whole. So, in principle, does it have an organism-like feeling or not? There's the concept of a center. This is more or less what we in other system theories is called an element. Everything is a center. We talk about centers. Every person here is a center. The windows are centers. So if we want to have a dummy term, then we talk about these centers. And typically, the quality of systems is increased when the density and intensity of centers is increased. Think about music. You go from Hänschen Klein to a symphony, and the density and intensity of notes and rhythms is increased, and you say, that's it. Yeah. Other ideas that are related with this is if a system has a form that is equivalent to its function, then it seems that this is something positive. If it's not arbitrary, but if it is efficient. And also we feel that things need not be perfect, that we love it. So something that is old, or some cathedral that is 200 years old, it need not be perfect. The important thing is that it's individual. It can have a roughness. It can be, the color can be broken down. So no problem. So I talked about this creative circle or creative cycle built on the pattern language idea. And the cycle goes this way, counterclockwise, from number 1 to number 6. And it has an output that comes here. It's the sequence of system transformations, the steps of development. And the patterns, the pattern language are a kind of input. And I go through these 6 steps. The first step is to look at the system as a whole, to understand everything, more or less. Then the designer looks for a center, a center where the development can happen, that has potential. It's called a latent center. It's not yet existing in the form that it will be. Now, third, he selects a pattern from his pattern language repository. And this may be conscious or unconscious. We all have patterns in our minds. Selects a pattern, then adapts it to the situation, and then the result is tested, whether the quality is right, and then the step is accepted or undone when it went wrong.
Maybe to protect your eyes.
Thank you. So this is typically Alexander calls this the generative process, but I have renamed it for this lecture to the creative cycle for various reasons. And it creates an ideal, typical model of the creative process And it's a kind of demystification, because I'm a technician, I wouldn't say I'm a creative person. So if I'm to draw a portrait, I'm lost, probably. Or if I have to compose music. But if I have such a scheme and I have the tools available, then as a technician I think I can cope with this. I can go through the steps and do this and get some result on. So it's actually helping people to, where I can help people to do something creative. And all this is on the third level of the pyramid. So I have not yet said what value function is to optimize. This is an optimization process, and we can optimize everything. We could optimize for profit here, for example, or for creating something extraordinary. But Alexander adds an ethical turn on this. And he says the perception of the whole system, this here, this cannot work from a remote position, from a designer that is sitting far away. It must include the people that live in the situation, those people that are involved. So this works only well with participation. And he says, okay, this pattern language, this is a kind of knowledge sharing of a cultural inheritage. So this should not belong to people. So it's something that's our common property. And here, when we are testing the results, he says this value function that leads our optimization, this should be this Lebendigkeit, or quality without a name. And it should be done in a way that we create synergy and all people profit from this process. So Alexander is US American. He lived in America for a long time. He is never really anti-capitalist. But I interpret him that there's a creative imperative. You remember Kant's categorical imperative. Yeah? This is a parallel. I say there's an implicit creative imperative with Christopher Alexander to design for people or life and not for profit. So people need not agree with this. They can create pattern languages in software and don't think about ethical dimensions. But others take this that seriously and think it's a way how our society should develop, and this could be a concept to bring us forward. And every single step and idea of this creative cycle has its concept card. And I won't go through all these cards and won't repeat the concepts. For example, there's this concept of reversibility, of error correction, or the concept step by step. But important point is that each and every one of these concepts can also stand for itself. It's not just in this creative cycle, but every concept is a valuable concept in itself. Another aspect that should be kept in mind is that if we look at the system, this was the step one in the creative cycle. If we look at the system and consider what would a change do to the system, then we have to look into three directions. This is the object that is changed, and it's in the hierarchy. It's in a kind of a tree. The system is a tree structure. And there's the upper level of the system. There are the neighbors, and there are the subordinated patterns. And here it is pictured as a container hierarchy. So there's the whole system, for example, the whole world, and the green triangle, that's me, for example. And if I change me, then this affects the world and it affects you. You are the blue triangles here. You are the neighbors. And it may affect things that are inside of me, my thoughts, for example, or my stomach, if I'm angry or something like that. So it's a simple help if we look at the system and consider what does it change to the system, what are the effects, to look into these three system dimensions. And container hierarchy is, of course, another of these cards. There's more to this. Christopher Alexander says that living structures have typical properties, structural properties. And he named 15 of these structures. And what you see here are early visualizations that I did in about 2008. So there are things like contrast, local symmetry, or gradient, or boundary. And I picked out 3 cards of this. So the idea is that all living systems have boundaries. We have a surface, our cells have cell membranes, our countries have boundaries. So what we have here is a word that gives us the power to describe systems of all kinds. So if we go to software development or music, then we can use the concept of a boundary everywhere. So this gives us power. Another one is, he says that living systems often have a very good form of adaptation to the forces. And you can see the force of the wind in the form of the sail here. So, or a chain that is hanging. Such forms that come from the forces are typical for living systems. Or this roughness and individuality, this diversity that is in nature, that's so typical of living systems. If you look at some tree, probably has a few 100,000 leaves, and if you cut them off and would compare them, then every leaf would be different. Of course, every human is different. So this variation is something that should be embraced. It's a part of living systems. We should not try to make our world a world of perfect duplicates. There are also principles of living processes, and I have already mentioned a few. For example, the idea to think about processes as step-by-step processes. Or, I'll jump to the next page. The idea that when we transform systems, if we do a transformation, then this transformation will only be stable when there are no losers. When everybody wins, there's no need to fight the change. So if we look before that everyone is agreeing and happy with what is done, and if we consider this idea of reversibility, if we are in error, if we hurt somebody, that we can undo this step, if we really get this kind of synergy working, then we get a stable development and stable processes. We cannot do a stable development when we want to have the biggest share and all others are the losers. So I think this is a big problem now with countries like Iraq, for example. The moment someone gets power, he tries to attract all the power and to make all others the losers. So with this attitude, one cannot get into a stable social development. This is very basic here in Alexander, but it's not basic in politics. So someone should teach that. Or another structure principle, process principle, sorry, is that nature always builds on the existing structures, or most of the time builds on the existing structures. So if we have a situation available, it's usually the best thing to build on this and not to erase everything and start from zero. And the third idea that is here selected is that there's rarely something new, really new, but that new things come typically from combining the existing things and give them a new function. So if you look here, there are two triangles, and we assume that we know triangles, and they are now combined and form something that is seemingly completely new and has a new meaning. So, most of the hard work is done. And I return to the work of creating pattern languages. How do we do this? How do we go about to find these patterns and put them into nice products so that people can learn from this? And I've put this in a U shape and say, this is the way the process goes. We start pattern mining and go down here. We have the patterns, then we have a pattern repository. This could be a card box, a heap of paper, but it could also be a computer database or a wiki, or something like that. And then we can go publish this. One of the conferences, for example. Or you write a book about your favorite patterns, pattern in music, or something like that. And when we do pattern mining, then typically the first step is a kind of brainstorming. Sit together on a pin board, put the notes on it, get the concepts, and do literature search or system analysis and get the main concepts. And then this could look a bit like this, although these are already kind of functional diagrams. This, for example, are the 23 patterns of software development that are here in this book. So this is we call this often a pattern cloud. So it's the main ideas. And then you think about the structure that the knowledge should get. And there are different styles. Christoph Alexander in his book used a pattern name, then some kind of ranking, a picture. He described the context of the problem forces, the solution, and resulting context. That's in his book. That was the first example. Other people use different structures. Peter Baumgartner, in his book on e-learning, used a longer structure. You can take such a form that fits you, follow some famous example, or create your own. The important thing is not to have a canonical form, but to have a reliable structure that makes ourselves accountable. You can go into the detail. You can, for example, look what means the context. Context is typically the configuration of a problem. For example, the bridge could be in the context of the development of a traffic system. And you have typically some target artifact or a designer in his role. So this could be the context. And you can specify this you can stay with the more general categories. So when you have found your structure, then you build these pattern descriptions. And this is, of course, very simplified. Not because of the number of aspects here, this is quite okay, but because of the text, I cannot write pages of text here. So I did and this is called a data and metadata pair. This comes from computing, it's not very handy. Metadata means the kind of aspect that is described, and data is the text information that you put into this category. So I'll just make this simplified example. So the name of the pattern is bridge. Okay, now I could talk about the problem. Problem: traffic often meets obstacles that hinder people moving or that hinder economy. So the solution would be to build a bridge to overcome the obstacle. The context would be the development of a traffic system. So we can think about resources. Okay, a bridge needs substantial investment, but this is highly dependent on the situation, of course. We could talk about a sub-pattern. If we have problems with financing, we could use a car toll, but this slows traffic. So this is a kind of rationality that relates to this pattern. And of course we could go on, and we can give examples and say, okay, an example to prove that this is actually the pattern works is Golden Gate Bridge or Tower Bridge or something else. Very often the concepts that are presented are not as clearly viable as it's here with the bridge. So examples are important. Here it's not so important. Okay. So in principle, this is like an entry form to a database record. But it's much more, because the pattern authors don't just give information, they reflect on the type of information, and they try to follow a systematic logic. They build a logic. They say, do we need to talk about resources? And if we talk about resources, then we should do this with all our patterns, so that we don't forget something that is important. So this is an interplay between the data that is coming from the experiential field, from the application field, and that is written down, and the structure that is developed. And the authors make themselves accountable. So we can check in this book, well, when Christopher Alexander said he would talk about context, then we can check that every pattern has its context, and every pattern has its problem and solution part. So this is something of high scientific value, because it can be controlled, it can be criticized. A normal book is hard to criticize. And now look a bit on, what is the time?
7.
Okay, I have 5 minutes. So, when you remember the U-shape was this, and we went down the U to the deepest point where the repositories were. And repositories are typically self-made. So the first repository was Watt Cunningham's Portland Pattern Repository in 95. And most patterns from software, early patterns came from this one. Doug Schuler, who did this Liberating Voices pattern, created a website with a database, and a few hundred of academics contributed patterns to the communication revolution. And after a few years, he then put these patterns from the database through an editorial process and wrote this book. And I also have an experimental wiki for collecting patterns. But the most promising system currently is from Professor Frank Kleiman, who is also in the organizing committee of the PurpleSoc. And he built a special wiki on MediaWiki that's at the basis of Wikipedia. So it's very Wikipedia-like. And he calls it Patternpedia. And it should be released this year. So I hope that we soon have a tool that everybody can use for free to collect patterns in a professional way. Now, when you go to publishing, then you have some simple decisions. You will decide which patterns to select, because you have a heap of patterns. And you decide on the target group. You decide on the pattern language format. What should it be? Should it become a book? Should it become a paper? Should it become a card stack, perhaps? There are different uses with this. And you will create an outline of these aspects, not necessarily that from the repository. Perhaps you simplify it a bit, or you adapt it to the audience, so it can be a bit different from data collection. And you may put your patterns not in one large pool, but create a structure of phases or of levels. Alexander did this with regional and city and building patterns and interior patterns. And if you would, for example, write a pattern language about chess playing, then you would have opening game patterns, middle game patterns, and end game patterns, if you like chess, for example. So you can make sections of this pattern language and give a better overview within this smaller focus. And you will decide whether you want to use implicit or explicit metadata. So I have tried to make this clear here. You have in principle the same pattern description, only hints how this look like. From Christopher Alexander, only a few words in each section. This is the title, this is the picture, there would be the context, this is just markup. Then in boldface, the problem description, forces, and solution. And this is implicit because one has to know in what ordering these aspects are. It's nice for reading, but there is in the introduction this is explained. This is explicit metadata. You see the red. Typically, this would not be in red, but I have colored it just that it stands out. You have the ranking here. This is the ranking by Alexander. This is context. This is forces, solution. So this is explicit metadata. I'm a big fan of explicit metadata because if you mix patterns from all different sources, and every source has a different ordering and different aspects and different naming conventions, then you become crazy. So it's quite nice to have explicit metadata, although we know that it's not popular. For example, in a telephone directory or with scientific citation styles, you also have implicit systems. So no one's in the references this is the publisher, Oxford Press. There's only Oxford Press in the right position. Okay, you decide on this, explicit versus implicit metadata. Okay, and then you arrive at a pattern language and a collection of patterns that have the character of a toolbox and of generic problem solution concepts. And you can put people to work, or you can proudly sit back with what you have achieved. What did Alexander do? He, for example, used his system in building a university campus in Japan, near Tokyo, and he created these patterns, took them from local building traditions, talked with people, asked them for their wishes, and created a highly awarded university campus, Aishin campus. Best Building in Japan award. Or he went to a slum in Mexico and he did participatory billing in a very early time. And he taught the people to build their own columns and their own building blocks, and they decided how to place their rooms, and everyone could build his house. And it worked out very fine. People were happy, and the project was turned down because the government felt that's too much comfort for slum people. So it didn't get over the first 25 houses or so. But the concept proved very satisfying. So what Alexander wanted is to change the role of the architect. He criticized his contemporary architecture, the postmodern architecture, as being monumental and image-oriented. The architect as a star, much higher than the involved people, flying high above the situation. And he suggested a different configuration, a human need-oriented architecture. The architect on eye level with the client and those involved, everyone has a voice. Everyone knows who is talking about through the pattern language and making decisions together. And the local situation with all its information gets a much bigger role than here. So what's this about, and we are now again in ethics, is that the architect-user relationship is a kind of archetypical relationship. It's similar to the relationship between a teacher and a student, or between a doctor and a patient, or a mother and a child. So we can look for the core idea of such relationships, of me and other relationships. And what we find is that we can have joy in this resonance and exchange and joy in mutual development. And this is what Christoph Alexander is about. So, of course, there's a card. The other and me, living relationship. And basically, it's about this kind of idea, and that the living relationship means to care, to take the other seriously, to devote time, to concede value, to respect the autonomy of the other, to support people, to feel the connectedness, and understand that we are in a mutual unfolding process. So this is actually kind of operationalization of love. So it's a nice thing that Alexander gives us such powerful tools. And the effects of pattern language work is that we do a lot of knowledge sharing, that we pull people into participation. We give them a voice and open the processes, and that we work for processes where all win. That's the idea. That's the ideal, typical process. Of course, this all can be questioned. Nothing is necessarily true. We are in science. It's hypothetical. So if you make contact with this science community, it's absolutely normal that you say, okay, but I don't believe this Lebendigkeit thing. Or I think there should be a different canonical pattern form. Or what are these patterns? Are they best practice? Should they be an ideal? Or are they just things that we find empirically? Are they existing practice? Are they viable practice. We can, what are the properties, structural properties that I showed you, these 15 properties, complete, or are there more? Are they wrong? Can mathematics be reintroduced to this? You see that in all this lecture I didn't use mathematics. So we cannot at the moment calculate the quality of living systems. And I hope we never can. But Alexander, as a mathematician, tried a number of times to introduce mathematics. And he didn't succeed. But maybe other people can succeed. It would be great if tools become available. So there is and this is only some points of the things people are discussing about and do not agree. So it's a rich scientific field, far beyond the 30,000 pattern languages and 500,000 patterns that I think exist and that are not yet described. So this brings me back to Purple Sock. So if you find something interesting in these ideas of Christoph Alexander of patterns and pattern languages and can make that work with your application field in some way or other, then there is this invitation of the Danube University of Krems and this Purple Sock workshop and conference to publish and present your ideas or your results, or to just participate and see what other people can put on the table. And this is the end, and I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it.